We're now going to talk about the larger landscape in which Herberg wrote Protestant Catholic Jew, thinking particularly about developments in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The major feature of this landscape was anti-communism. So if you'll remember, after 1945, the major geopolitical issue that occupied the United States was anti-communism, particularly its relationship with the USSR. Remember that one of the reasons the war in Asia had ended was because the United States dropped a nuclear bomb. At that moment, it alone had a nuclear weapon, but fairly quickly the Soviet Union also developed one. So this was the era of the Cold War. Now, I want to just acknowledge that the war was very hot in various places around the globe where the United States and the Soviet Union fought kind of, people call them proxy wars. But between the United States and the Soviet Union, what you had was a Cold War, a military buildup, and a recognition that they both possessed weapons that could destroy the world. That meant that for a lot of people in the United States, one of the primary ways they identified themselves was as anti-communist. And they identified people on the other side as communists. One of the characteristics of communism that played very importantly in this discussion was atheism. Officially, the USSR was an atheist state. That goes back to the understandings of communism propounded by people in the 19th century like Karl Marx, who saw religion famously as an opiate of the people. So Karl Marx is the father of communism. He believed that one of the functions of religion, or maybe the primary function of religion, was to make oppressed people content with their lots in life because they would have a better afterlife. So that was an opiate. It was basically a drug. Fast forward, his descendants, in a way, although whether or not Karl Marx would have recognized what happened in the USSR as anything like he was talking about is a different question. But the USSR defined itself as an atheist state. So for a lot of Americans in the 1940s and 1950s, the fight wasn't just between communists and anti-communists. It was between atheism and godliness, between the ungodly and the godly. So for a lot of people in the 1940s and 1950s, this was an explicit link that they made, particularly religious folks. So you saw this with the man who's here, Fulton Sheen, who was a Catholic televangelist, basically. He had a weekly show, and he talked about Catholic beliefs and Catholic doctrine, but he was also stridently anti-communist, because again, to be communist was to be against God. The 1950s also saw a concerted effort to tie U.S. democracy, free enterprise, and religion together. The historian named Kevin Kruse has written a really important book on this subject, and what he shows is that particularly under the Dwight Eisenhower administration, business leaders, religious leaders, and a lot of political leaders tried to keep this tie in the minds of Americans so that they would think of capitalism, democracy, and godliness as all going together. And oftentimes the way that they thought about that was in terms of the dignity of the individual. This was the kind of the way that this was thought about, that democracy was the political way of ascribing dignity to the individual, capitalism, with its lack of kind of government oversight, gave liberty to the individual, and that religion then was also about the liberty and the dignity of the individual. Now, people can disagree on the necessary relationship between dignity in the individual and any of those, but that was a way of holding them together that was really attractive to people, again, particularly in the light of the Cold War and what was going on around them. So there are features of American life that a lot of people today assume have just always been with us that actually come out of the 1950s, and I'll just point to two. The phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance, "under God," was not always there. It was put into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. So the idea that this is one nation under God came out of a particular historic moment when the United States was trying to compare itself to, again, the ungodly USSR. The phrase "in God we trust" as a national model comes out of the 1950s, when that was put on money and seen again as a national way of thinking. So again, the point here is the landscape that Herberg is writing about is one that's defined by the fight against communism, and where people are very much making a connection between what they see as American democracy and free enterprise and religion, as opposed to totalitarianism, communism, and lack of religion. One of the key figures in religion, in American religion, in the 1940s and 1950s, and really till the end of the 20th century, was a man now deceased named Billy Graham. In the late 1940s, Graham was a young evangelist. That means he was someone who went around preaching the gospel. He would have been on the more conservative end of our liberal-conservative divide. And he was also someone who, like many people at the time, was sort of stridently anti-communist. He wasn't actually all that successful at the beginning of his career. His big revivals, they called them crusades, a term that his organization would stop using after 9/11, but in the 40s and 50s they called them crusades, didn't necessarily draw a lot of people. But a famous editor, Henry Luce, heard about Graham and heard his preaching and liked the message, like the Christian message and like the anti-communist message, and so told his reporters to puff Graham, famous words in American religious history. And he became a phenomenon. People flocked to his revivals, flocked to hear his preaching. And part of what Graham did, again, was to marry a strident anti-communist message with a focus on individual salvation, the notion that what is wrong with people is that they are separated from God and that they need to be saved. And then, and this was key to Graham's way of thinking, that saved individuals would help make a godly society. But you started with the individual, not with the big social problem, but with the individual. We've seen this way of thinking before. It goes back to the early 19th century evangelicals, right, who tried to convert individuals and then wanted those converted individuals to create civil institutions that would help to redeem society. Well, we're seeing that again. Another thing to note about Graham is that he was part of a kind of resurgence of conservative religion in the public square. Again, if you go back to our episode on after the Scopes trial, many people assumed that conservative religion was going to disappear, that it was just done and over with. But what actually happened, I said, is that conservatives kind of withdrew from a lot of public recognition, but they didn't disappear. They actually were working on having networks of people who knew each other. They were investing in colleges and radio stations. During the 1930s and the New Deal, some of them were protesting the New Deal because they didn't like it. They saw it as collective action that was opposed to the individual and the sanctity of the individual. So they never had disappeared, but to people who, say, wrote for the New York Times or who weren't really paying attention, it looked like they had disappeared. And some of them, some of these really conservative Christians, kind of thought that they had lost political clout, which was probably true. So in the 1940s, a group of them, with whom Billy Graham was affiliated, decided to reassert themselves. And one of the things they did is they rejected the fundamentalist label. They thought that being called fundamentalist was not helpful, that it was made them sound like they were trying to be separate from society. The other thing they didn't like about fundamentalism is that some fundamentalists suggested that you could only work with people who agreed with you on pretty much everything doctrinal, so that you could only work on, say, a political issue with people who had your same theological views. These evangelicals wanted to say that you could work with people towards common ends, even if you had different political beliefs. And Graham was part of that. This group renamed themselves, rather than calling themselves fundamentalists, they talked about themselves as neo-evangelicals or the new evangelicals. They created a new group called the National Association of Evangelicals. And what they wanted to do was, again, to have a voice in political and cultural life. Their emphasis, though, was going to be on working on individuals first and then in society. That was different than a tradition that I mentioned in the previous videos, the neo-Orthodox tradition. The neo-Orthodox tradition grew out, again, as a reaction against a certain form of Protestant liberalism. The neo-Orthodox tradition thought that the liberal Protestant tradition was way too optimistic about human capability, human progress. They thought the Protestant liberal tradition way underwrote the problem of sin, both personal and then social and systemic. There are different branches of neo-Orthodoxy, but the American branch was profoundly shaped by two brothers, Reinhold and H. Richard Niebuhr. Reinhold was a theologian, H. Richard was a historian. And perhaps one of the ways to think about what bothered the Niebuhr brothers comes from a quotation from H. Richard when he's describing liberal Protestantism. And here's what H. Richard says. He says, in liberal Protestantism, a God without wrath saved a people without sin through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. A God without wrath saved a people without sin through the ministrations of Christ without a cross. In other words, you have, according to H. Richard Niebuhr, a religious tradition that says people are basically good. God has no reason to be upset with anything going on in the world. And Jesus came to save people from their niceness, I guess. The Niebuhr brothers looked around the world and just said, well, this doesn't make any sense. Reinhold Niebuhr one time said that original sin was the one empirically verifiable Christian doctrine. All you had to do was wake up and read the newspaper to see that sin was a real social problem. So the Reinhold brothers, among others, reappropriate strong language of sin and justification, but they don't do it in the same way that, say, Billy Graham did. They want to think again about the Bible as being in some ways more metaphorical. Sin isn't a metaphor and justification isn't a metaphor, but they think there's a lot in the Bible that isn't historical. And they want to think more about the implications for all of this on the social level. So they tend to be politically much more to the left than, say, Graham and his cohort. One of the things that particularly Reinhold Niebuhr emphasizes is what he calls the irony of American history. And this is going to sound a little bit like Herberg. He argued that in America, our idealism, our sense that we have these grand ideals and we always do the right, makes us profoundly unaware of our fallibility, of the ways that we can mess up. And so we go off into the world to do what we think is good, having kind of no check on ourselves, and we end up wreaking a lot of havoc. Reinhold Niebuhr called the United States to really think about how it was using its power. At the same time, Reinhold Niebuhr argued that the United States had a responsibility in the world. He didn't think that the nation or Christians within the nation could just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, it's hard to be a good Christian and be in politics, so we're just going to not be involved. He didn't think that you could say, well, war is really icky, so Christians just shouldn't be involved in it. He said that not going and saying fighting Hitler was a lack of responsibility. You still needed to act in the world. You just needed to act knowing that you didn't have all of the information, that there were always going to be unintended consequences. So in many ways, neo-orthodoxy had a very pessimistic view of human capability, perhaps even more in some ways than Billy Graham does. They didn't think that once you regenerated individuals, you would have this society that could really do good things. They thought that we were always going to mess up, and yet we still had to act anyway. So coming out of the 1940s and 1950s, we talk about two major divisions within Protestantism. Again, these map onto things we've already seen with liberals and conservatives, so keep that in mind. This is kind of another way of naming that. On one side, you have what we call mainline Protestants. Mainline Protestants. These are old denominations that had more tolerance of theological diversity. So to go back to the Scopes trial, they're the Northern Baptists and Northern Presbyterians who refused to make people sign on to the fundamentals, not because everybody in those denominations were so incredibly liberal, but because so many people in those denominations wanted to allow for a theological spectrum. The major denominations that we call mainline, and this is today, some of these denominations in the 1940s and 1950s weren't in their current forms, but we think about the following being mainline denominations: the United Churches of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the Episcopal Church, and did I say the United Churches of Christ? Or the American Baptist Church. So 7 major denominations. We think the term mainline comes because these are the kind of the old brick institutional churches that would have been on the main trolley line in a downtown area. The big brick beautiful church downtown that's a sort of a sign of, you know, stability and has a long history in the neighborhood. In the 1940s and 1950s, these mainline Protestants were, for the most part, still in that kind of anti-communist milieu, still invested in the United States as a godly nation. But we can begin to see them in the 1940s and 1950s moving towards a critique of the nation, a critique that particularly their leaders, their kind of seminary professors and people who work in leadership will make more explicitly in the 1960s. They're beginning to wonder if the United States is really acting more as kind of a colonial or ne-colonial power. They begin to have doubts about things like capitalism. When the civil rights movement gains a lot of traction, they'll begin to wonder to the extent that the United States has been irreparably, or not irreparably, but inextricably linked with racism. So in the 40s and 50s, not quite there yet, but you can see it coming on the horizon. As they look around the world and what's happening, and they see revolutions in, say, China and the independence movements in Africa, they begin to ask if part of what's going on there is a rejection of Western colonialism and imperialism, and how much the United States is a part of that. They also, as denominations, tend to have more of a focus on the problem of social structures. So they still care about individuals becoming Christians, but they also care about the ways that social structures affect people, and the way that we could more, say, fairly set up an economic system or a political system as a way of helping people flourish. On the other side, we have, again, evangelical Protestants. These folks are the ones who we talk about re-emerging in the 1940s. Again, they didn't really re-emerge in many ways. It's probably better to think of them as rebranding in the 1940s. There are still fundamentalists. If you want to think about evangelicalism as an umbrella and fundamentalists as kind of under the umbrella on the rightmost side, that's probably an okay way to do it. In evangelicalism, there is less room for theological diversity. There's more expectation that you're on board with what they consider their orthodoxy, and that is primarily about seeing the Bible as being if not absolutely inerrant or without error, being pretty close to being without error in what it affirms, say, historically. There's less of a critique of the United States or capitalism in evangelical Protestantism. They are more comfortable with the kind of we're the godly anti-communists against the Russia or against the USSR. There will emerge eventually in evangelicalism some critiques of the United States, but it's a smaller group. It never gains the kind of traction in particularly white evangelicalism, as it does in the mainline. And there's more of an emphasis on individual sin and individual salvation. So two kind of major groups. There's some overlap. This is more of a Venn diagram than a stark difference, but there are some, again, pretty pronounced differences that you can see in them, particularly as you move out from their centers and get to their right and to their left. So what happens to the 1950s? Well, the 1960s happens to the 1950s. We'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks when we talk about the rise of the religious right, but fair to say that to the extent that there was a sense of a cultural consensus in the 1950s, a cultural consensus around, say, anti-communism, a cultural consensus that the United States was a godly mission that was basically doing good in the world, a cultural consensus that the United States was under God, that begins to fall apart in the 1960s. We'll talk more about this next week, but part of that has to do with the civil rights movement. As the civil rights movement gains more and more traction, people begin to see the justice of its cause. There are more and more questions about whether or not it's possible to think about the United States as in any sense a godly nation. You have major Supreme Court decisions in the United States, particularly involving things like reading the Bible in public schools and praying in public schools, that to at least some conservative Christians seem to take God out of the public sphere, seem to suggest that what the United States is becoming is an atheist nation, like those terrible communists. You get, countercultural, obviously I meant counterculture. You get the counterculture, which anytime you have a counterculture, you're operating against the consensus. People who seem to be throwing off tradition and stability and those things that had marked the 1950s consensus, whether that was real or imagined, the counterculture really suggests that it was no more. And then you get things like the feminist movement and eventually the gay rights movement that challenges some of the things that people in the 1950s had taken for granted, like the role of women or the nuclear family. Note that word, the nuclear family, right? The family that was going to stand strong against the coming tide of communism. So from this kind of point in the 1950s where you had a lot of people invested, as Herberg said, in this American way of life, they see it absolutely tied to religion. In the 1960s, multiple things happen that seem to threaten that consensus. Now again, whether that consensus is real or imagined, it felt real to a lot of people who find the 1960s to be a pretty significant shock. So a few outcomes and questions. What happens? What does all this mean? Well, for some Americans, the 1940s and 1950s really did mean more acceptance as being truly American. For some Catholics and Jews particularly, it really was a moment of greater inclusion. For some Americans, the 1940s and 1950s really give them a sense the nation has a special relationship with God and a special role to play in the world, particularly as an anti-communist nation. But for some Americans, the 1940s and 1950s are still a time of continuing exclusion. African Americans, Japanese people being put into internment camps, people who aren't able to be part of this cultural consensus or excluded from it. For some Americans, like Herberg or the Niebuhr brothers, a sense of frustration with the connection that people are making between country and God, a real concern that both doesn't honor God and allows the country to do things that it probably shouldn't do. And then a question. Can a religious tradition offer a useful critique of the country? And should it? Should religious traditions be taking on the country? And that is what we're going to look at when we look next week at the civil rights movement.